Up next, my conversation with Ibrahim Zaghw. I am yet to meet a person who knows more about content strategy than him. If you're in marketing, this episode is packed with actionable advice that I know you will want to use the next day at work. We talk about buyer's journey, content structure, measuring success, the role of websites, and much more. It's so good. I'll let it speak for itself. I will see you on the other side. You've spoken quite a lot about understanding customer motivations and desires. How do you approach that at the outset of a content strategy?
So I think you first off have to realize that the buyer's journey is super different for different industries. I'm not just talking B2B from B2C, right? Like for instance, some of the factors that will really impact the buyer's journey is the maturity of the industry itself, right? So in an industry that's very new or nascent, what you're going to have is what's known as, so there are three main types of purchasing behavior. There's new purchasing, modified, and direct repurchase, which basically means if I'm buying something new, I've never bought it before, I don't have the evaluative criteria. The risk parameters are high. I don't know what to look at. And as far as I'm concerned, I don't even know what this thing does, right? It's like the first time iPod came out, right? Nobody knew what that was, and they were all concerned with Walkman. A modified repurchase is I'm buying something, I'm not exactly happy with it, and like that sort of can take us into customer loyalty. And this is more of a conversion part. So for instance, I buy Nike shoes and now I'm thinking of buying Adidas, right? Like I know how to judge a sneaker, whether it feels comfortable, how the fit feels, all that. And then a straight repurchase is when you're super loyal to a brand and you're not converting, and all the brand has to do is just like maintain that relationship and you know keep things going. So the reason that differs is because if I'm addressing customers doing a new purchase, what that basically means is I need to start really early on. I can't start assuming they know what the product is. I need to start addressing the problem first, making them convinced like, hey, you shouldn't be using a Walkman. You need to buy an iPod. But if I'm talking to someone sort of who buys Nike shoes, I don't need to create content that necessarily talks about the importance of sneakers for exercising. So that is the first thing. The other element that might differ from industry to industry is level of involvement, right? How big of a purchase is this? What are the risks associated with it? And how does this purchase impact your sense of identity? Like for instance, when you're buying something in the FMCG sort of category, right? Like I'm buying, laundry soap. Doesn't really matter what I buy, right? Like you could easily switch brands at drop of a hat.
Yeah.
But when you're buying something like a car or anything else, the amount of research you do is huge. So like I would say in some brands even that is like, for instance, if you're doing something for FMCG with little to no involvement, investing too much in educational content that expands on the benefits of soap and the ingredients, everything else wouldn't make sense because very few people would read that. But that same content in a high involvement category where a lot of research is involved, whether because the risks are high or because the level of sort of identification with the product is high in the sense of this product shows, then it becomes a matter of what kind of content you want to create for that. So that's the first thing. Once you're clear on the industry, then the next part becomes, all right, how does this brand differentiate itself from the other brands within the industry? Like that's the second question you ask. So like, what are strategic advantages, everything else? And usually you want to create a content strategy that emanates or comes from the strategic advantages, obviously. So with all that said, once you've had that all said, then you can start of thinking, all right, now I can understand the buyer's journey. And what you want to do, obviously, is there's a distinction between the content created for the buyer's journey and the distribution channels used to deliver that content. Again, you always want to marry the two as much as possible. But like, I know I'm saying a lot of things and like trying to give you as much as possible, but that is usually how I think of it. But all that being said, I think when it comes to the buyer's journey, you need to have something in place, even if it's something pro forma first, and then you start talking to people and start adjusting it. But it is 100% critical.
I assume that buyer's journey is different for everyone. Would you say that's true? I mean, probably towards the end of the funnel, it sort of unifies again. But maybe at the top of the funnel, all those personas or those customers will have different motivation and desires for reaching out for your product. Would you say that's true? I'm just maybe trying to think about reconciliation, which was another talking point for me later, but since you brought it up, I might ask you about it right now. Those all those personas, right? That talk about personas. There's this famous meme that King Charles is compared with Ozzy Osbourne, and on the demographic paper, they look the same. They both married. They born same year. They both live in a castle. Okay, that's great. But that's not how you really create personas. That's like you have to go way deeper. You have to go for the needs, the desires, right? The motivations, the internal, external triggers. How do you reconcile all of that? And before you answer, my problem with this is, for example, I have web design agency, and whoever thinks about websites, they probably instantaneously think about marketers. So marketers should be my primary target because chief marketing officers, head of marketing, marketing managers, they all work with websites. They lead the website efforts and all of that. There's content team underneath them, etc. But it essentially all comes down to marketing. But then I do all the research and I sort of look into things in our CRM, etc. And I find that actually, marketers, yes, they exist in that realm, but there is like commercial director or there is product manager, and they all inquire about websites. So these are such a widely different people with different desires, different needs, different stages of their career and motivations, like who they respond to, etc. How do you reconcile all of that? Where do you put focus on so you can actually make the most impact possible with your content?
Okay, so I think that's it's a very interesting, it's a packed question, and I'll try to break it down first, and then I'll respond to it. So your question basically is, at the top of the funnel, there are so many different personas, and the issue is that each one has different motivations. And the classic example used is a website where you have marketers involved, commercial directors involved, product managers, and it makes sense though. Like websites are one of those places where, and it's one of those things you hear, right? Like any web design book, I'm sure you know, would tell you that the last thing you want to do is design your website by committee, having like sort of everybody like pitch in. Ends up it's sort of becomes a hodgepodge of everybody just throwing stuff at it. So I completely get that. And then your question is also the issue with personas and how they're drawn is the use of that, which is a different topic. They use demographics, they use sort of elements, a lot of which might be sort of irrelevant to the purchasing process or purchasing decision. And accordingly, because if it were sort of relevant, what you'd find is, again, like the comparison between Ozzy Osbourne and King Charles. Did I capture both questions fairly well?
Yes, absolutely.
All right. So they're both very different questions. But I want to start with the first one first, which is, the product manager and the website example. And the reason I want to start with that is because I feel that once we answer that, we're going to align hopefully on the terminology we're using. And then that will allow us to move on. Okay. And this starts again with realizing the industry we're talking about. So in the B2B space, it's different than the B2C space. In the B2B space, the way I think of it is this. A persona is different than a profile. So you first start off with a profile. The profile is the type of company you're doing, right? So if I'm designing a website for, let's say, a company that works in the agricultural field, that's a very different experience than designing a website for a fintech company. That's the profile of the company. Within the profile, you have different personas. Each persona represents what's known as a stakeholder. And it's at this point where something called the stakeholder matrix comes to play. So part of, again, like earlier when we were talking, part of what I do is I'm always writing things down to help clear my own thoughts, right? So this is part of like a lot of research, everything. So in any B2B industry, you have different stakeholders. Different stakeholders are people with different motivations and different powers. And we'll talk about those two in a second. The main people you have the initiator, the gatekeeper, the expert or technologist, the influencer, decider. Like these are different roles and different personas within the purchasing process. And what happens is that these different roles show up at different points during the buyer's journey. And like we can discuss that thoroughly in a minute. So for instance, the initiator is the person who sees the change the most. They're the ones who are convinced this gap exists, right? Like for instance, they're the person who feel that the website needs a design agency, so on and so forth. And they're usually the biggest champion. The gatekeeper has access to sort of information. The technologist could be the engineer at a company who sort of gets to say whether this development framework or this will work or not, whether that's the best way to keep hold of the data. And then, like, for instance, the purchaser could be the CFO, the decider is usually the CEO or the person who puts, their finger on the button. So, like, these are all different stakeholders. And a lot of times in a single purchasing process, these could be different people, or a lot of them could be grouped into one person. So, for instance, right? And this is another thing that matters. In the B2B process, you always need to be aware of the scale of the company. So, if I'm approaching a company where it's a 5-man operation, they're a startup, they just got a seed fund, what you'll find is that the CEO is playing all 5-6 roles. He's the initiator. He has all the information. They are the expert because usually they're the engineer or whoever who started the company, right? Mm-hmm. But if I'm looking at that same B2B process and the company I'm addressing is 200 people strong, what ends up happening is that these different stakeholders each is played by a different role. And this is why part of your targeting effort isn't just about the industry, it's about the size of the company. Like, you need to be very clear about the size of the company that you're addressing, because that will also impact your content strategy. If I'm addressing companies that exist in the 200 to 500, person level, then I need to address all those different stakeholders. And each one shows up in a different part of the funnel. So, for instance, the expert or technologist shows up in the lower part of the funnel, right? Because they're the ones who start making sure that the solution works. Whereas the initiator is the person who's addressed the need. And we'll discuss, like, we'll look at these again later when we start talking closer about the funnel. But, like, now that we're talking about the different elements of the different stakeholders, I thought we'd go through this. So what's interesting is that in any sort of B2B company, what usually happens, you have something called the buying center. Now, this could be either a formal group in much larger companies, or in smaller companies, it's an informal group, right? Like, if it's a startup and it's 3 people, then usually they form the buying center. You have to win them all over. And it's very easy that if I have 2 people, but the third person has veto power, then they don't, right? So each stakeholder has a particular kind of power. So you have reward or coercive power, attraction power, expert power, status power. And there's a really good HBR, like Harvard Business Review paper, that sort of talks about this. And it's over here. I'd be happy to send the link. Mm-hmm. So you need to also be aware what power they have, because you need to prioritize them accordingly. So, for instance, if the type of power that the stakeholder has is reward power, right? Like, they're the influencer, there's someone who sort of is able to make sure that things go forward, you want them to be your champion. In other words, I want the CEO to be excited about working with me. But if I'm talking to sort of the expert, which is, as we saw, like, that's a kind of stakeholder, so this is the engineer, they only have veto power. So the most important thing is to make sure they don't have a reason to say no. So even the content you go could be different. So if I'm writing content for the CEO, I'm going to be more emotional. But if I'm writing content for the expert, I'm going to be more technical to make sure that we're passing everything with flying colors. So understanding all this and having all that is in and of itself the part, but these are different stakeholders. What matters at the end of the day is to look at the profile itself. So, for instance, when I'm looking at a company's profile, I'm more concerned with how they're using the site than with what are the site constituents. Meaning, are they using the site as a conversion sort of hub, and they're following like a product-led growth strategy? That's a very different sort of company than a company that needs their website to help brand awareness. And usually what they do is they're not going for product-led growth. They actually want people to reach out, set up demos, and then, for instance, they'll talk to them. Like, that's very different. So again, like, and here I don't want to throw too much stuff here, but like, I'll just end on this. Here, the job to be done belongs to the company, not to the profile. Like, each persona, each stakeholder has different requirements when it comes to the job, and we can talk about that. Mm-hmm. But at the end of the day, the job to be done in its entirety belongs to the profile, which is the company, which is why B2B is a bit different than B2C.
Yes, everything you've said perfectly aligns with my experience with a particular client. If I can just very quickly sum up what happened, is that an interim chief of marketing approached us for a website build, and everything went smoothly until more people got involved into the decision process, right? And so first objection they had was design by committee. How do you prevent us from going down that route because I know how it ends. The website becomes for no one. And also later, when we got over that objection with our workshop approach, we hit another sort of block on the way, which was CTO, right? Is this the technology that you're proposing working for us? And we proposed WordPress because that's what the marketing team felt great with, and they've been already trained with WordPress. So we thought, hey, how about we just continue with that and save you on training costs, and we can still build WordPress very well. And the CTO, obviously, being amidst all the latest tech, all the React, Next.js, all the brilliant stuff, he was like a bit concerned. Let me say that. But we had a couple of interviews with him, and I think he eventually warmed up to us and trusted us that we're gonna do the good job. Because at the end of the day, WordPress is a tool, and how you handle the tool depends on your skills. And we got the skills, if I can be honest. And then yeah, that's gonna work. So that absolutely aligns with me. Could you very quickly reiterate to me, because I think I'm somewhere on the fence, what's the difference between profile and persona?
So in B2B, profile is the entire company. In other words,
Okay.
I'll give you a very simple example. If I'm creating websites, right? At the
Yes.
end of the day, the website is owned by the company, and the decision to invest in the website is a decision that's made company-wide.
Mm-hmm.
Now, in an ideal scenario, the company is aligned, it's everything else. And the reason this matters is because if a company, like the profile is defined by the industry, because like for instance, very simple case in point. If let's say you're building a website for an e-commerce brand, the needs of that brand is very different than for a SaaS startup, right? Because like this might be different than that. One company might need to sort of be able to show that they're out of stock. They want to sort of highlight, let's say, new products. The SaaS startup wants to be able to do other things. It wants to be able to maybe invest more in content, regardless. So the point is, the profile is the company itself. The personas are the people within the company that represent different stakeholders. The only reason you're doing that is because you understand that each different stakeholder within the company has different needs and different expectations, and you need to know where they exist within the buying journey so that you know when to address them, and you know not only how to address them, but what influence they have. But at least that's how I approach it, and it makes it easier in the sense of I always think of, all right, this is the first person I want to address the top of the funnel. I need to get them on board. I want them excited before we start talking to the rest of the buying center, so to speak.
Would you say that buyer's journey in B2B is most of the time the same when it comes to people inside business? So the decision chain is exactly the same. So it starts with initiator and it goes all through the hierarchy always the same way, or do we jump hoops?
No, 100% it differs, right? Like for instance, again, and this is why we started off with the conversation at the beginning, which is it really depends on like, let's say, simplest case in point. If this is a modified rebuy, like this is a purchase that the company's done a million times, right? So let's say they're buying a SaaS solution to help with their conference calling, right? Like the company's buying Zoom access to the entire company for whatever, and for the entire company, and they don't have to sort of jump off every 40 minutes. Perfect. So now someone comes up with, a proposal. Zoom's too expensive. We want to use Google Meet. Perfect. Because this is something they have evaluative criteria they've done before, it's easy. The people involved in the buyer's journey is, let's say, they're far fewer than if the company is making a brand new purchase. So for instance, if the company is buying something like a new building and it's never bought a building before, it's acquiring a new company. They even might bring in people outside. They might bring in an interim CFO or something to help with sort of the calculus, with the purchasing process, with, let's say, getting bang to help. Like the point of this is whether this is something that they're comfortable doing and they've done before, or it's something very new, is one consideration. The other element is the element of risk. Like and risk has two components, right? The first component is how likely is this to blow up in my face? And that brings up sort of the adage of nobody ever got fired for hiring IBM. The second component is how much is this costing us, right? Like the bigger the cost, the bigger this is an investment. So you really don't want this to get like you don't want this to like to fuck up. You want it to be the right thing. You want it to be the right choice. So it's these elements, and the riskier the buying decision is, the more people are involved and the longer the journey takes. So for instance, you have things where the sales cycle could be a couple of months, and you have things where the sales cycle could be a year or two. Bain and Company looked at both B2B and B2C, and they highlighted every possible element of value that could exist within sort of a transaction, or within sort of like a B2B act of transaction, maybe. So for people who aren't able to see this, the pyramid is broken down into 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 elements, right? At the bottom, you have table stakes. In other words, in any B2B transaction, these are the things that we need to see. These are the specifications. And again, like going back to your point, if I'm a company and I'm making a new purchase, I don't know exactly what the specifications could be. Like a big part of the buyer's journey in that space, if it's a new purchase, is research on what specifications should be. But if we've done this before, we know what we expect. What's an acceptable price? Regulatory compliance, ethical standards. These are all table stakes. And then you have the functional value. And this is sort of where things start to sort of increase more. Right? So like you have functional value from an economic perspective and from a performance perspective, right? How good is the product? How easy is the product scalable, right? Like, can this product, for instance, allow us to sort of bring on more employees? If I'm a 10-man operation and I become a 100-man operation in a year, do I need to change vendors or change products, or can I stay like this? Then the ease of doing business. This is more about sort of the facilities the company offers, right? Like how responsive is the company you're working with? And the reason I'm mentioning all this is because a lot of times a good business strategy is about picking the elements of value you want to focus on. So for instance, and I feel that like a company that works in the SaaS space might say, we want to have a responsive customer service team. And a lot of these things will define not just what you're offering, but the people you're targeting, right? So for me, if I'm offering responsiveness, then I'm offering people who need to sort of have this product up and about consistently all the time. And an interesting thing, I think it was a product marketer. I don't remember her name right now. I can try to send you her name. She's really brilliant. She showed how the funnel and the elements of value sort of are related in a very interesting way. So if I want to get a champion on board and I want to convince them, hey, this is a good idea, the first thing you want to do is you want to focus on the inspirational individual value for that person. So you want to show them the vision of sort of what you have to offer and get them sort of that sense of like, your company will be better. That's why usually it's the CEO, CMO, someone up high. But if you can't reach them, it's at least the person with the high, like if it's a really big operation, like a 400, 500 man company, then you don't need to reach that level. You can go a bit level down. But a big part is also the individual values. Like, how will this purchase help your career? I realize that this is super small fun, but like, will it help you expand your network? Will you sort of become, will your reputation remain intact, right? Like, you're not going to get known throughout the company as someone who got in a bum vendor. And even from a personal perspective, like a lot of times an individual sort of decision maker, and going back to like the stakeholder matrix and looking at the powers, a person who has veto power or can be a champion, they could be a champion just because they love the design and aesthetics, or they feel, you're safer. So they're not feeling, as anxious. And then once you've gone through that upper part and we have a champion and you've convinced them this is a good idea, then you go through showing that your solution is the best solution. Like, you've established a need, everybody sees that you solve that need. Ease of doing business is one of those things that makes them feel that this is a good solution, right? Like, for instance, from a strategic perspective, you reduce the risk and they've looked at the numbers. You're flexible, you help save time. So these are all the values that you could offer. And depending on how these differ, the different stakeholders might differ. The company, of course, if you're addressing different profiles, that will differ. So no, I'd say the B2B journey, you could cluster similar profiles and say those profiles have a similar journey, but saying that the entire B2B space has the same journey, I'd argue there is some nuance there. And appreciating that nuance, I think, can make a big difference in your strategy overall.
I can very quickly see how this is becoming complicated and overwhelming to people. But no, I appreciate the level of detail. This is crazy. I've never seen this chart, and it immediately reminded me of Maslow's hierarchy of needs.
It is based on that, and like that was actually the inspiration. And B2B, Bain and Company also had a B2C, elements of value chart as well. And I think you are absolutely right. It's overwhelming to take all this in 100%. But I think there's a point in time where like when you go off this and then it starts making sense because you're connecting the dots. Like I remember when I was inundated with all this, a lot of it felt like there are so many points to think about. But at some point you start, like for instance, the elements of value is one of the best tools for copywriting because it helps you show what are all the possible elements of value you could highlight in your copy. And then you figure out like what are things that resonate the most. So they're all tools and frameworks. And even if like anyone listening took away 10% of this and then listened back and everything else, I think for me, like when people explained this to me, I was like, oh my God, just lit up light bulbs for me. So
I love this is my brain right now. Yeah, like just because I'm as you speak, I put everything I've done for my company through that filter, and I'm like, okay, I fucked up this one. Okay, okay, can we disconnect so I can go and fix it?
I get it.
Yeah, this is how I go. But yeah, thank you so much. That was great. But you mentioned this as a tool, right, for B2B, for content strategy, copywriting. You do have a couple of other tools up your sleeve, and the one I found was a Limbic Map and Jobs to be done. Could you elaborate on them a bit?
Sure. I'm just trying to think of where to start because like they're both different. So, all right. So let's start off with Jobs to be done first. I love it. I'm a big fan of it. And like, the idea simply is this. Whenever you're buying a product or anything else, you're not buying that product. Like, you know, that old adage in product design where you're not buying a drill, you're buying a tool to help you create a hole, and you don't want that hole, you want to hang a picture. Like at the end of the day, when you go to a sort of like your Home Depot or something and you're buying that drill, at the end of the day, you're buying that drill because you want to hang a picture. The drill is nothing more than a tool and you're hiring it for that job. So the idea of Jobs to be done, I think it was Clayton Christensen who forwarded the concept. He was like, always be aware of what job your product or service is being hired for. And it's never the thing in itself. Like, for instance, if you're doing a website design, right? Your website design, the job to be done could be, for instance, and the job to be done is usually a task. Like it could be, you want the company to look good, or and a lot of times, if the company isn't aligned on why they're hiring or why they're doing this, or they're not aware of their job to be done in turn, like they don't know what their reason of existing is, right? Like they don't know why they serve their customers, and they're all over the place, which you see a lot of the time, unfortunately. It becomes muddied and everything. Again, we go back to the whole point of design by committee. And it's not just in websites, like even in marketing strategy, if everybody has their say and everybody sort of getting to sort of tell you how they feel things should go without a cohesive strategy, like feedback is important. But if there isn't a cohesive strategy tying everything together, it's very easy things to go overboard. So Jobs to be done is simply this. It's a concept or a framework that says people hire things for tasks, and understanding these tasks and how your product fits with them is important. But that being said, the best thing to understand Jobs to be done is what's known as a job map. And a job map defines a job to be done in different steps. And once you understand those steps, I feel that one of the best ways to segment, whether like in the B2B space, your profiles, or to segment your personas in general, specifically in the B2C space, is the job to be done concept. So the way Jobs to be done started was Clayton Christensen was hired by a company, a diner in the States, right? And the idea was they wanted to increase milkshake sales. And they did everything, like they tried different flavors, and nothing worked, right? So at the end of his wits, Clayton Christensen decided, all right, let me just ask the customers. So when he talked to customers, he realized there were two main types of people. There were people who bought milkshakes early in the morning and people who bought milkshakes late in the evening. The people who bought it in the morning, what their story was, these were people going to work, and on their way to work, they were picking a milkshake. Now, the problem was they weren't picking a milkshake because they wanted the milkshake. They picked the milkshake because it was thick enough that it lasted them for the entire ride till they arrived to work. And that is different, right? And that's why they never went with a banana. They never went with a chocolate bar. They wanted something that would last like 20 minutes while they were on their drive. So to cater to those people, the simple solution was, since the job to be done is to keep them company on the road, let's make our milkshakes even thicker. That way the milkshakes will last longer. And that increased sales of the morning group. And the other part of that was, well, about the evening group. So the evening group, these were parents who picked up their children, maybe from class, maybe from some sports activity, or just from school, an activity at school. And on their way home, their children wanted dessert and everything else. And while the parents wanted to like cater to their children and get them something, they felt that, getting them chocolate or getting something sweet would be too indulgent. So they figured, well, we might as well get them a milkshake. It kind of, there's milk in it. It borders on that. So then for the later group, they created maybe a flavor or something that was quote unquote healthier. So at the end of the day, the earlier group wanted something to keep them company. The later group wanted something to make them feel less guilty about, acquiescing to their children. So accordingly, what you end up happening is, once you understand the jobs to be done, these different two profiles or personas, this is more of a B2C space, they were able to adjust the product accordingly to increase their sales. So that is where understanding the job to be done comes in, right? It's like, oh, once I understood this, I was able to cater to them. And once you understand that a job to be done has 1, 2, 3, 4, 8 steps. This is what's known as a job map. The first step is define. You determine the goals and plans of the job to be done. The second step is gather. You gather all your needed resources. You prepare for the job. You set up the environment to do everything you need. You make sure that you're ready to do the job. It's one last check. You do the job and you monitor its execution, and you keep modifying and course correcting as you're doing it. And then the last thing is the conclusion, where you do maybe a post-mortem. So let's use a very simple example. Let's use this podcast that you and I are on, right? So our job to be done, for instance, and again, part of the conversation you have is, what is our job to be done? Like, it's never crystal clear. And a lot of times, either you talk to your customers and you sort of try to figure out how we figure out the job to be done. That in itself is an entire conversation. But like, to stay on point, we wanted, for instance, our objective here was to share marketing knowledge with B2B marketers. That was the job to be done. So the first thing is, that's our goals and plans. We're going to share marketing information, gathering items. So what we did is, all right, Tomasz, you want my email? All right, here's my email. We gathered everything. Here's the tool. We're going to use Riverside, yada, yada, yada. And we prepared that. Part of that preparation and confirmation was the call we had last Tuesday, making sure everything's going fine. Now we're doing the job. And we're currently monitoring, making sure our specs are up, everything is everything. And let's say while we're doing the job, internet connection goes down. So we have to take a pause and then go back. That's the modification part. And then by the end, there's the finishing the job. It's like, all right, how do you think this went? Do you think we shared what needed to be shared? All right, where do you think we should go with this, right? And that's the conclusion part. And the reason this matters is because when you look at it, you realize that Riverside, it belongs in this and this step, the gather and prepare step. Like, the tool we're using to disseminate this is Riverside, and them understanding where they belong in the job map and what the job to be done they're helping us serve is critical for them to be able to sort of market to, let's say, you and me. Mm-hmm. So that is how like the job map fits and understanding the job to be done fits. And for me, again, like, this is a process, and drawing it out can take time and everything. But once you have that clarity, that vision, a lot of the later conversations become much easier to have, because are we addressing the job to be done? Are we addressing something else? It becomes so much easier, and the opacity that you see in a lot of marketing teams gets cleared up because you've had these hard conversations.
Okay, cool. So we'll get to Limbic Map in a second, but for now,
I forgot. All right.
No, that's cool. That's cool. By the way, I never heard of this concept of hiring tools, as in when we're speaking about service provision. It just seemed very interesting to look at, let's say, web design as a service, but being it a tool which is hired to do the job. It's just slight shift in thinking. It's very interesting. But when you were describing all of it, what screamed at me all the time was agile. And agile methodology has been part of my life for the good part of 5 years now. We've turned the company into agile, and we preach agile wherever we can. Because at the end of the day, agile is all about where you are now and where you are going. And the thing in between sort of gets filled up as you go. Now, I don't mean you start the journey being completely empty-handed. You bring with you your experience, your experts who know stuff, who walked the path, and you have some kind of intuition, right? And you have this luggage that you take with you, but you can't expect unexpected. It's just impossible. And so when you are on one hill and you see the other hill that you're trying to get to, and there's a valley between you, you have to take that first step with all the luggage that you could muster and start progressing. And yes, there might be a river to cross, there might be a log to jump over, but you correct the course as you go and eventually reach the destination. But had you not had this mindset, you would have never started. You have to be prepared to improve, to adjust, to learn, and course correct. So when you showed that diagram from define to job done, this is literally it. And I was so happy to see the improvement step in there, because this is all about iteration, all about course correcting. So yeah, totally appreciate that. And final step that you mentioned, when the job is actually done, when we are disconnected, all is done. It's almost like retrospective exercise in the agile world. What went good, what didn't go so well, and you keep thinking, so the next time you approach this dilemma, you are better off, right? So always keep learning, always keep improving. So these were my thoughts when you were describing all of it. Very interesting, and I can appreciate everyone trying to be agile, and I go to an extent. This is silly, but I'm gonna mention it. So an example from my life, my partner, she's very do-it-yourself. She loves doing stuff at home. Construction, not construction, everything. And she one day decided to put a new fridge into the kitchen, and we didn't have a space. So, this is the beginning. She defined the goal, right? I want big fridge in the kitchen. The job to be done is to fit it in. Once it's fit in, we're done. But the problem was that we have slant roof. It's a kind of cozy kitchen. So what she did, she cut away the top, a bit of top, so to squeeze it in. But hey, she started first with a handsaw, and that was pain. So then she went for electrical saw. That did the job. But then she moved the fridge in, but the cord was too short. And so, those things build up, but eventually you reach the destination. And it was just agile in real life, pure example of a person who doesn't even know that agile exists because she's not into tech space at all. So it was fantastic to look at it from the side and see her iterations, those failings, those learnings, that progression. Great stuff.
I love that story, man. Beautiful stuff.
Yeah, funny. And
there's something there I want to point out, which is very interesting, right? Because part of the reason Just to Be Done is really interesting is because it doesn't just talk about what your product does for the customer, but it tells you what you're competing with. In other words, in your job to be done, your partner was sort of trying to move the fridge. She used a saw, then she used an electrical saw, all that. But the idea was, the end result is she wanted to put the fridge in.
Mm-hmm.
But going back, for instance, to I'm trying to think of a clear example where you wouldn't think there could, like, for instance, going back to the story of the milkshake story. You'd never think that a milkshake and a banana are competing, right? Like because they're very different things. But the thing is, for the people who are on their way to work and needed a snack to keep them company for the duration of that, those are two competitors. And that's the thing, is like, one way to expand the realm, or like the space within which you think you're competing, is through jobs to be done, because you don't think of your direct competitors anymore. You think of any possible substitute that could help get the job done. So it is super powerful. It is very agile. And I love that story of like that sense of, you have to course correct and you have to learn on the way. 100%.
Yeah. And then those things, as you go through the agile method or the job to be done map, new things sprung up on the back of it, right?
100%.
Because
Yeah.
so it's like when you decorate your living room and you can't imagine everything up front. So it only makes sense to put that sofa in as a piece, the main piece, the centerpiece, and then think of what the lamp could be, or what the like those things eventually need to come together. But you can't just, I mean, you can design all of it, but it won't really matter, because if you put it in and it doesn't work, it just doesn't work. So instead of being committed fully and just shoving everything into that room at the same time, hoping for the best, you can do it in iterations, in steps, and course correct, because it's cheaper, easier, and more efficient, more effective, I guess.
So I'll tell you, this is how I think of it.
Yeah.
I think entrepreneurship and business in general, they're learning, like a lot of people think, I think they're learning endeavors first and foremost. And the trick is, how do you maximize your learnings while minimizing your costs? So for instance, you mentioned they could do design. Now, I think the way I'd approach it is, design makes sense, but not as a control methodology to sort of make sure you have everything planned, but to see different things. Like for instance, I don't need to put that duvet next to, for instance, that carpet to see whether they fit or not. I could just design it rather than buying them and realizing it doesn't work. And that's a lower cost methodology to give you the same information. Now, obviously, some information you can get without actually executing. Like, for instance, I can't get customer feedback without putting a product in front of them. 1,000%.
Mhm.
But I also feel that a lot of times you see people and they want to build like a full fidelity product. It doesn't have to be, it just needs to sort of be in, and that's like where the concept of MVPs come in. And
Yeah.
that's a whole thing in itself. But I mean, the way to approach it is always ask yourself, how can I maximize my rate of learnings and have it accelerate? Like, it's not like, the thing is, learnings don't just compound. As your company grows, each person you bring on helps increase that. So how can I maximize learnings while minimizing the cost of each, new thing we learn or walk away with? And obviously there's that element of experience. There are so many things, like getting someone who's been there, done that, and having them disseminate their information, their knowledge could help lower. But a lot of times you're going to be in new circumstances that nobody in your company's seen, and you need to figure it out. But yeah, and I think I'll end on this again. It's part of where I'm coming from, because a lot of times you come to companies and, for instance, they're doing this and we've been doing this for a year and it's not working. All right, what have you learned? Have you tried figuring out why it's not working? And they just like shrug their shoulders, and you sort of like, well, then you're not really moving forward. So I think you always want to be aware of what are you learning and how can you accelerate that all the more.
Yeah, I think you touched on a concept of the value of information. Overall, when you live in the times of highest uncertainty, like you know nothing, then almost everything will tell you something. It is just no other way. And the closer you get to 100% of certainty, the more expensive the information becomes. So at some point, you have to decide whether you invest more because it's going to pay off later and you can measure that. Or you stop halfway there and say, okay, I can make educated guess with the information I have already, and it will be okay. So yeah, that's also another conversation. But it's really
no, 1,000,000%. And like the thing is, because I was talking about this, like one of my favorite books that discusses that topic is Thinking in Bets by Annie Duke. So Annie Duke used to be this like professional poker player. She went through the circuit, won a bunch of sort of like competitions and tournaments, and she took the way poker players think, because poker players always have to think in probabilities, and to a large degree, poker is not played against the house; it's played against others. So obviously, there's a skill element involved, a huge skill element involved, and good players can consistently over time be making a profit. So she took the way poker players think and started giving seminars and lectures to people in the finance world and the business world. And she then created a book around that way of thinking, which is called Thinking in Bets. And it is very much that. It's how to sort of make decisions with uncertainty or with incomplete information, and how to sort of realize that at the end of the day, you just have to make decisions with the best information available. And one of the best things I loved is to always avoid judging things by the result. In other words, I could make a decision, and given the information I have, it's a bad decision. Like, it has a likelihood of succeeding of 10%. There's no way I could justify this, but it works. Does that make it a good decision? Or the other way around, right? Like, I could make a really good decision. It has a 97% chance of success. it should work in any world, but then there's always that 10% chance it fails, so it fails. Does that mean my decision was bad, or does it mean it's just like 1 out of 10 things are gonna, fuck up? So
Yeah.
I feel that is so true. And I think that you have to be able to make decisions under uncertainty. It's just grappling with those decisions and moving forward is something that you develop with time. And that's part of the learning process, obviously.
So speaking of uncertainty and so-called success, which is highly subjective topic, in content marketing, so bringing it back to the discussion about content, what key metrics do you use to measure content marketing success? It feels very, I'd call it intangible, but like I'm sure it can be measured, but it's just like the in quotes intangible. How do you approach this?
I think it's really it depends on the objectives, the goals, everything else, right? Like for instance, if I'm trying to create brand awareness, how much does this get seen? And also like what channel of distribution? Because like you always are aware that the different channels, like for instance, SEO, right? How are we ranking? How is this how is this helping increase our visibility? And a lot of times you're not creating content for one channel. Like for instance, I could be creating a content strategy where I want to rank for Google, but I want at some point we can take all the blog pieces we put together and we created, put them together and create an ebook that we could distribute later on, right? So the strategy isn't just about boosting our ranking on Google. It's also about having another asset, which is the ebook that we could distribute. For instance, if I'm going, let's say on social media, like Twitter or anything else, what engagement are we getting? What is the quality of the engagement? Are we engaging with the right people? And are we resonating with them? If it's copywriting for a page, which is, it's not exactly content marketing by content by current definitions, but I think of it as content. What are the conversion levels on that? So even email, sort of like, what are the open rates? What are the conversions? All that. So you just need to be clear on the objective for starters. Like any metric needs to start with the objective and the goal. But the other thing that I'll say, and again, this goes back to my perspective on learning. I'm not always concerned with the metrics as they are. I'm just concerned that they're always going in an upward trajectory. In other words, we could be creating content that's way below the benchmark. Like for instance, let's say the average engagement on a platform like X is 1% per tweet, right? So out of every 100 people, one person likes or replies or retweets or something along those lines, right? And we just, that's it is what it is. And we create content and we're getting 0.1% engagement. That doesn't bother me. I'm fine with that. But what I want to see is next month, we go from 0.1 to 0.2. And then the month after, 0.2 to 0.5. Like, I want us to be consistently going up an upward trajectory and to maintain that consistency. But the last thing I want is to sort of be plateauing where we're not growing and things are just stable where they are. That's the thing that scares me a bit.
How does quality go? How does quality goes into that formula that you have? So, like, so how do we? I guess how do we make sure we don't follow vanity metrics?
So those are two different questions. How do we not follow vanity metrics and quality? So the problem with quality is it's very, in content specifically, there are elements that are easily agreed upon, and then there are things that are subjective. So, for instance, design, right?
Yes.
How I can direct a user's attention to a particular part of a website or a page. This is something that, to a very large degree, there are a lot of studies about. There are a lot of things about that. To a large degree, there's this sense of agreement and ubiquity. Like we all know that this is how it works, right? For instance, when you're writing content, there are particular sort of ways of looking at content where you're like, this is the best way to understand it. And if you write it in another way, it's going to feel opaque or hard to understand, specifically if someone doesn't know. There are particular pitfalls that all content writers will fall into, right? And you kind of coach them out of it because you've seen it time and again. For instance, one of the bigger ones was the curse of knowledge. A lot of times, if something is really clear in our head, we assume other people know it, but that's really the case. That being said, there's the other part that's subjective, right? So, for instance, that's the more stylistic part. For instance, do we like the logo color here? So long as the colors aren't so contrasting that it's visually exhausting, there's a point where it becomes stylistic, even the writing, right? Like even so long as the writing is solid and everything else, whether the language is, too informal or anything else, that becomes more stylistic and it's all a matter of quality. So, and the reason I'm highlighting is because a lot of people will mix the two. So a lot of people will give feedback assuming they're improving the quality, but they don't realize this is a stylistic choice. Whereas a lot of other feedback is necessary because without it, the comprehension of the piece or its effectiveness will dwindle, and that is something that that just needs to be highlighted. So that's on the one hand. The other side of that is how to sort of be like how to differentiate at least between vanity metrics and actual metrics. So I think one of the things that I always look at is effectiveness. In other words, and I want to explain, right? Let's say the end objective of all this, we're creating content, and the end objective is I want to convert. So if I'm looking at followers and I'm using that as a gauge to sort of like, for instance, it's a funnel, and the bottom of the funnel is the conversion, but the beginning of the funnel is number of followers on a platform. One way to make sure that you're not looking at vanity metric is granularity. So you don't look at number of followers, you look number of followers from this group or from this group or from this group. So for instance, if I'm, let's say, if I'm a local store in New York, and I sell local products over there, then for me, number of followers is vanity, but number of followers from New York, let's say from the borough of Manhattan, is way more actionable because those are people who could actually buy from me. So, and then let's say you want to be even more granular. I want to look at the number of new followers of people living in New York who are tech enthusiasts because I sell technology applications. For instance, obviously, there are a lot of caveats here, and I don't know if that's the best strategy. I'm just giving an example off the top of my head. So granularity is one thing. That's the first thing I'd look at. Like vanity metrics could be deceiving because you're looking at a whole collection and you're treating your entire segment, your customer base as one monolith rather than using the different segments and breaking it down. A. B is always having two metrics opposing that balance things out. So for instance, you could have, for instance, followers and engagement. And the reason you're having those two is like you're not getting people who are just following, you're getting people who are actually going to engage with you, and trying to maintain that sort of balance between both metrics where you're making sure that you're balancing both together and increasing both, or at least increasing one without sacrificing the other. That's another way to go about it. And then there's just like good conversation. Like you need to, if we agree that building business or any significant work is a learning process before anything else, then you always need feedback. Like at the end of the day, I'll sit down with someone and I'll be like, hey, Tomasz, I think I'm doing this. This is the campaign. Here are the objectives. Here is how I want to measure. What do you think? And then you're going to play devil's advocate. Well, what if this happens? What if this? Are you considering this? How are you going to collect it? All those things. So like those are the three things: granularity, using opposing metrics or different metrics to sort of make sure you're seeing the bigger picture, and just taking feedback as much as possible.
So I guess we could call that granularity a secondary dimension. So you bring just another vertical to the equation to see things from more granular perspective. But whenever you create content, you inevitably you play a game, some kind of game, like Google game, LinkedIn game. And then when you have those metrics such as impressions, engagements, comments, etc., aren't you worried that you will sort of make decisions based on some kind of anomalies that you didn't necessarily see through? Does it make sense? So
okay,
the question doesn't make sense?
But I'm going to rephrase it and you tell me if I understand correctly.
Okay.
Your concern is if you start creating content and you're trying to distribute it, let's say through whatever platform, where do you draw the line between creating content that's user-centric and ideal for the user versus content that is gamified and optimized for the platform, which might actually compromise the user experience? Is that a good way of rephrasing the question?
No. So this isn't what I meant, but it's a good question anyway. But however, so okay, let me maybe lead with an example. I post on LinkedIn 3 times a week, and some posts do great, some don't. I have no clue why that is that. Like, there are so many variables: time of posting, keywords, volume of text, type of asset, all of those things. How do you know that when you go retrospectively through your posts and look at what worked and what didn't, that this is a valid observation, valid assumption, as opposed to a dangerous assumption that might lead you astray? Is that better?
Okay. So basically, how do you optimize content?
Based on what? Yes. Yeah.
Okay. So I think first of all, it starts with being, and you have to have like, you're talking about a point in time here, which I feel would work much better if everything that preceded was done well. Like if you have a clear content strategy that's based on a clear marketing and business strategy and everything else, so you already know what differentiates your content. You already know who your audience is. So the first thing that you do is you talk to your audience, right? Like talk to the people who've seen the post, because usually some of those people are already your customers or clients, hopefully. Like unless you're a business that's been, that's just starting out, usually some of the people are new and some of the people have, get in front of them, ask them, what do you think? Like if you have some diehard fans who are super loyal to the brand and, love everything you touch, ask them, why do you think this is good or bad? That's one thing. The second thing that I'd say also is important here is, because you're aware of what's differentiating you and what makes you work and what doesn't make you work, you could always look at the competition in the space, right? And this is the thing. There is an element of luck involved. So you don't know, like, was this a lucky post or is there something there? Did this cater? And like, obviously, if the difference in reaction is so huge, there's likely something there. But what I would say is also look at like the different people posting in your space and learn from them. A lot of times, once you're clear on what works for them or not, that will give you a good indication. And this is again part of the research and planning phase, right? Like sometimes people will tell you before they've written a piece, they'll look at stuff like Reddit and stuff like Core and everything else, and it's not the content, they're looking for the topics, right? So like let's talk about content in different elements. There's the topic you discuss, there's the format within which it's discussed, and like the execution and all that, and the marketing assets. Like these are all different variables. So you look at each one individually. Look at the topic. If this is a topic that's been proven popular in other platforms, it's most likely popular, right? So that's one thing. Then look at something like the execution, right? You can contrast it to others. Is there something different compared to what you've done before? Is it not? Like that's assuming that you can't get it in front of an audience and you can't ask their opinion. I'd also argue that aside from a competitive analysis and aside from asking people and aside from all that, there's always, again, if it's an established company, answering the questions that get asked the most, like FAQs. So those are usually successful. So going to your point, how do you know what works, what doesn't? A lot of guesswork. Try to get in front of customers as much as you can. But if, like the most important point, if it makes sense in the sense of it fits within a larger strategy, then you should be able to make an argument for why you think this works or why it doesn't. So for instance.
Okay. That screams agile again.
It's
very
all
iterative
agile.
process.
100%. It's 1,000,000% iterative. But like,
yeah,
for instance, Twitter, if you're creating a post and Twitter prioritizes engagement, and you have a couple of posts where you're engaging, but you're using something that's, unique or specific to your company or brand, it's a fair hypothesis to say that that engagement component helps your visibility more than something that doesn't do that, right? But when you're creating two posts that look very similar and both topics seem very interesting to people based on what Reddit has, maybe just one post got lucky. Maybe it got picked up by the right person who retweeted it and that boosted it more than anything else. So there is an element of luck, 100%.
Just a while ago, you mentioned segmentation. There are different segmentation, like price segmentation, demographic segmentation, firmographics, all of those sorts of segmentations. What segmentations do you find the most helpful for content strategy?
So you start off thinking about jobs to be done, like what job are we serving? And that's the first element. And usually what you'll find is different jobs to be done will be accompanied by different job drivers, and we'll talk about that in a second, and different motivations, different sort of concerns, everything else. So, for instance, job drivers are the circumstances surrounding a job to be done. You could have company size, company budget, company strategy. These are all things that define how much of a priority the website is. Does the company have a clear strategy? Why is the website important now? Like, these are all the elements of job, and you'll find that there are a lot of things that align here. So, for instance, companies of a particular scale, a particular size, everything else, usually if they're small, for instance, they're not using their website as a conversion base. And the very simple reason is that because they're small, they still haven't built up the SEO credibility to sort of drive traffic to it. So they have to use, for instance, something like ads. Again, we're talking hypothetically here. So accordingly, it's conversion, but it's not driving organic traffic. So you understand that they might be starting to invest in organic content, but they're still not 100% pushing for it. So because of all that, and because you're aware of all that, that is a segment with a particular level of problem that's very different than, let's say, a company that's been doing organic for a while, but they're trying to sort of add a new product. So they're trying to figure out how to create a different content strategy while maintaining their blog. And like, again, it's segmentation starts with the job to be done, then goes to job driver and figures out the stakeholders within that, all that. But you'll find a lot of similarities there, and it's easier to group once you have that. I'd also maybe add something like the Limbic Map, which we'll talk about eventually. But I think aside from all that, you have to understand that, and this is how I approach this. This could be different for everybody, but I think part of good strategy is targeting, in the sense of, once you've identified segments, if you're starting out, for instance, pick a smaller segment than you usually would. So, for instance, don't say I'm going to approach everybody. Say I'm going to approach companies that are 5 to 50 people with this level of budget. They just got investment this round, because their problems are usually very similar. And then pick an industry or vertical that they sort of serve that's also similar. So the more surrounding or like job drivers that they have in common, the higher the likelihood that when you approach them, their problems will be the same. So their buyer's journey will be similar, which goes back to that question, right? So that's the segmentation that I'm a big fan of. But I think it doesn't make sense to segment based on things that are relevant. And I think once you segment a target particular segment, you start developing your own positioning and brand. And to end on that point, for instance, if you look at cars, the people that Mercedes and BM target are different. And the people that those two brands target are different than someone who'd go for, let's say, a Hyundai or a Toyota. So I think at the end of the day, you have to realize that who you target and what elements of value you offer them and all that defines your positioning and how your brand is perceived. Is it a high-end luxury brand or not? So I think segmentation is not only important, but if you're doing really proper segmentation, your positioning and brand will be defined in turn.
I want to circle back to those limbic maps that we've been promising for the past 45 minutes. Can we sort of touch upon what they are and how they help?
Sure. So the limbic map basically is it's a hypothetical framework. And again, I'm a big fan of frameworks just because I think they're an excellent way to just start a conversation and to sort of make sure that the conversation stays in the pocket, right? Like, for me, the Limbic Map talks about different motivations people will buy. And it says that anybody buys something for 3 main reasons: either dominance, balance, or entertainment. And we'll look at the Limbic Map in a minute. But where they exist on that, like sort of like circle or oval or however you want to describe it, that's one thing. But where you as a company exist also matters, right? So for instance, if I sell Rolex watches, then I exist in the sort of like dominant space. Like, I'm sort of like the luxury high end for people who want to display their affluence, right? But if I am a healthcare brand that, let's say, helps people with, let's say, post, like they've had a surgery and after that they need care, so that's what my brand offers, then I'm in the very balanced section. And this matters because, not only do you understand their motivations, but you understand their emotional space when they're interacting with you. So you're able better to emotionally resonate with them. Your content resonates better. Your copy converts better. That's one thing. but also it's a way for you to, again, target and position, right? So you could have the same product, and that product, if you situate it in a different space to the limbic map, you are implicitly targeting different segments. And I want to explain what that means. So again, going back to the car example, if I want to target people in the dominant space, like I want to help them show their affluence, I'm going to be the Mercedes or the Rolls Royce of brands.
Mm-hmm.
But if I want a car that exists in, let's say, the balance space, or maybe like lower a bit where people feel safer, then I am the Volvo, or maybe I'm even like, the van for the family station wagon. Something that parents can feel safe as they drive their kids. They're not trying to show affluence. They just want something that they know when they're driving, their kids are safe there. So it's a tool to realize that usually when people buy from you, their motivations are stable. So you want to match that stability with your positioning, your content, your marketing, your assets, and every other brand touch point.
So did I get it right that the limbic maps are tools to create the context in which your business exists?
I don't think they're to create, they're to understand. And there's a
Understand.
difference, because
Yes.
I think that that context is always evolving, and I think it's very hard to sort of like, I think that's something that I feel a lot of people make a mistake, is like they try to force their positioning and everything else.
Mm-hmm.
You can try to aim for a positioning, but a lot of times, and that's part of the agility and the learning process, right? Like you're not sure you're going to end up where you expect you will. So I think it helps you better understand where you are and gives you an idea of where you'd like to be and how to align everything accordingly. But again, it's a tool that could help with that conversation. There are other elements involved, but I definitely think it can help to hone that conversation 100%.
Okay. Okay. So now we sort of learned about what's the content, how to measure its success, and how to approach it among different stages of buyer's journey, where the segmentation comes into play. Now it's time to execute, right? To actually put the content out there. There's a framework that you mentioned. It's called TEEL. It's
Ah,
for
yes.
content structure. Could you explain how this helps in crafting clear and actionable content, the TEEL framework?
So, okay. So, one of the first, all right. So, I think one of the issues when it comes to writing is that writing in and of itself is something that can be a bit exhaustive.
Mm-hmm.
So, like, you always want to make the reader's job as easier as possible, right? So, for instance, a lot of times one of the mistakes that you'll see, specifically like people who are very much early in their like who haven't been writing a lot, is they'll write a paragraph and it won't have a topic sentence, and they'll think, "Hey, this is obvious to everybody." It usually isn't, and like having a topic sentence is super important because it situates every. And one of the best books that I would recommend for writing, improving your writing, is called Sense of Style by Steven Pinker. So Steven Pinker is a cognitive psychologist. He works in psycholinguistics, basically how language is interpreted and everything else. And he uses a lot of what he's learned to help people improve their writing. It's a beautiful book. I
Wow.
recommend it to everybody, sort of like anybody who's ever worked with me, specifically like within the writing space. It's one of the first things I have them read. So one of the things is like he discusses the importance of priming people, setting them up, explaining what they're about to read, and just using like a solid topic sentence. It's one of the first things, one of the solid things that he spends a lot of time just explaining. Anyway, so the TEEL framework is that, right? It's like it starts with the topic sentence. T is it's an acronym.
Mm-hmm.
T is for TEEL, and then E is explanation. So you start with a topic, you explain it, and then the other E is for example. So you give an example for what you're discussing, and then the L is how you link this topic to the bigger, broader topic of everything you're writing, right? So if I'm talking about marketing and I want to talk about jobs to be done, I'll explain I'll explain there's a framework called jobs to be done that helps with understanding why people make this purchase decisions. That's the T. Explain it. I'll explain it more. I might even talk about job maps. Example, I'll talk about maybe something like the milkshake story. And then L, I'll explain how that links in the sense of it helps us build better personas. It helps us sort of create better content and inside everything else. And that would be in a larger piece about, let's say marketing strategy or something along those lines.
Okay. How does timing come into the play here? I know you're
Timing?
advocate. Well, schedule. over content schedule. So why do you advocate for thinking about content in quarterly intervals? Is there any room for kind of what's next approach, like let's just winging it, or do you always plan everything ahead and don't account for any flexibility?
So I'll say this much. I think it depends. Like, and it's very tricky. I'm always a fan of content calendars, and I'll talk about it in a second.
Mm-hmm.
But I also feel that if you are experimenting with your content, right? Let's say you have no idea what works, you have no customers, it's the first time you've ever created content for your brand, and and even like your space is sparse with content. Like not a lot of people are creating content, at least content that works.
Mm-hmm.
So you're trying something new and you're experimenting with it. Then it's very hard to have a calendar because you're going to be putting up a lot of different content formats, different content ideas. Of course, there are like basics and fundamentals that you're trying to observe, but just because they're basics and observed basics, they're just starting points, and you don't necessarily know whether there's something that are transferable to a larger picture. So that's A. But the second part of that is, okay, so now we know what works, we know what doesn't, but we realize that it's a long-term game. We have to put the effort and everything else. From an operational standpoint, you have to you have to realize that if you have a clear strategy and you know what you're supposed to do, there are a lot of logistics involved, right? Like for instance, I need, let's say, to interview someone for a piece, or I need to spend this amount of time researching for that piece to come out good, or anything else. So to make it all possible and to facilitate that, you do need some planning ahead, right? Like obviously winging it is good and everything, but at the end of the day, you want your content to be differentiated. You want it to be different and stand out, and that takes planning. You want to be able to sort of milk your company's strategic advantages, and you need to figure out. So for instance, if your company has access to, let's say, proprietary data, like let's say your company is something that keeps generating data, and a lot of that data has very interesting insights. Like for instance, that's what Glassdoor did. Part of what made Glassdoor's content so unique is they look at average salaries for this position and talk about the changes that happened, which is all data it had, and it just needed someone. But going through that data, finding the insights that would be most interesting to the people, that is in and of itself something that's effortful, and it's going to take time. And it's very different because very few other brands could do that at the scale that Glassdoor can. But that is the point. So I think winging it, you'll generate content. And if you've never generated content before, I'll just tell you wing it, just to get in the habit of producing content. But at some point, if you want your content to stand out, if you want to create stuff that is memorable and differentiates you and all that, you're going to start having to plan. And you don't need to start aggressive. A quarterly plan is something you have, and maybe like start monthly plan. If you have a monthly plan, that puts you ahead of the game. Quarterly plan is usually just for like those really big pieces that need considerable planning ahead of time.
So this kind of ties back to living in uncertain times and almost anything giving you some kind of information. So like when you start brand new on social media, you just create content, you winging it. This is your uncertainty at the highest point, and you see what sticks, right? And
not really. That's not what I said. No. So I want to be clear.
Okay.
When you're starting out, the planning isn't not there. It's there. It's just you're doing different planning. You're thinking of what are the different hypotheses that make sense. What are the different ideas that could work? Why would it work? There's a lot of research, trial and error, a lot of documentation and postmortems. In other words, the part of the reason that planning is difficult is because you're trying to do as many iterations as possible, and all the mental effort and time is spent in coming up with hypotheses that make sense. There's no winging it here. It's just like, I think this hypothesis makes sense based on this and this data point.
Okay.
I'm a big fan of this. Any decision you make, not even in content, in business in general, in anything, you have to be able to make a rational argument for it, because we're investing money and effort and time into this, right? So like if you're to sit with me, Ibrahim, why does this idea make sense? And it's not even content, it's like, I want to bring on someone new to help us, or I want anything else, right? All right, make a good argument, make a business case for it.
Explain why.
If you explain why. And it's the same with content, because this is time that you could be doing putting in something else. So why do you feel this will be valuable? And again, it comes to your strategy, it comes to your audience. How will this resonate? How will this tell them something they haven't heard? Is it going to say something they've heard but say it in a different way that will engage them and get them think? If you can't answer any of that, then, and this is what I meant by wing it. I want you to wing it because a lot of people have that initial concern of they put out content, would it be good? Will people just put out content to get comfortable with the idea, to go past that fear of judgment or anything else? Like, don't worry about people will say. Some people will love you. Some pieces of content will be stellar. Some will be mediocre. Some will be really bad. You'll have everything over the spectrum. You need to get over that concern. Once you're over that, now you can really start thinking, all right, how do I differentiate myself? How do I learn more about this? But I think winging it as a strategy indefinitely is less than ideal. It's just a way to overcome that initial concern or anxiety.
Sometimes I would see on LinkedIn companies like IKEA just sort of reacting to real life events, and I bet they didn't plan for it. Like, it's something just happened on the political spectrum and they just react to it in a clever way. So I believe there needs to be some kind of flexibility, some kind of wiggle room to fit that in, right? Because it costs resources to create some kind of short-term campaign. Even with the resources that IKEA has, it's still time because you need to think it through for, well, given us, yeah.
That is part of it. You could build that into the system, and I'll explain that very simply, right?
Okay.
For instance, let's say you're a news company, or you're something that needs to be quick. Mm-hmm. Part of what you're going to be doing is you're going to be designing templates to make sure that the minute something comes up of, let's say, interest rate cuts or interest rate hikes, we have to, like, a lot of times what news publications will do is they'll have the same story written with two different versions depending on how things play out.
Oh,
in other words, I'm not against moving quickly, but that needs to be factored in. Like, for instance, if something happens and I need to respond within half an hour, and there are certain, like Twitter, the half-life of a tweet is 6 hours, right? If something comes out and I kind of don't respond within it to a day, every other tweet that talked about it is just dead. So you need to be quick, but you also need your art director. You need not like your graphic designer, whoever it is, to be able to be responsive. If you need a marketing asset to help, so having that built in the system and having people know what they're doing and why this matters. In other words, when IKEA does this, like, for instance, one of my favorite, I think Oreo. So there was like a Super Bowl back in the States a couple of years ago, and there was a power outage, and Oreo sort of did this like immediate Twitter response where they're like, the power goes out, but Oreo doesn't, something along those lines, which was really clever. I think that in of itself, as much as it seems sort of instantaneous, it looks instantaneous, but a lot of it is because a lot of planning and preparation. Like, a lot of preparation goes into stuff seeming spontaneous, but I promise you, like, there is a system there that makes it work, and an ability to explain why that needs to be the case.
It sounds very counterintuitive, right? Because, I mean, no one can expect a power outage, and now you say it's planned for to an extent. So that's very interesting. Yeah.
Look, the way you think of it is this. So, for instance, one of the best things that they'll talk about, right? Let's say you have a social media team. So every other team, you're going to give them, like, for instance, the people who work on your blog or anything like this, let's say a head of marketing, right? The people who work on their blog, everything else, their capacity is to produce 2 blog pieces, each one 2,000 words a week, right? Like, we're talking about like really crunching numbers, operational side. And let's say on the Twitter side, I have people who can produce 10 tweets a week. Each tweet is of length, let's say whatever, right? And the tweets are a particular element, like that's assuming we know what we're doing. What I would do is I would give the blog writers 2 pieces, but I would have the Twitter people work on 8 tweets or 7 tweets, not the whole 10. And that Slack exists because if there is an event, they can respond quickly, whatever it is.
Okay.
The art director, the graphic designer, I know what they have and I prioritize things, right? So something happens, is like, this becomes a priority A. So how do you build responsiveness into your system? How do you build Slack? The more, like, agility and Slack need to coexist together, obviously. So how do you create some Slack in the system so that if something shows up, you're able to be responsive as much as you need? These are all elements that take element, and these are costs. In other words, if I have an individual who's producing way lower than their capacity, that is a cost I'm putting up.
Yes.
because I want to remain flexible.
Yes. So
But
so I only want to mention it's the same philosophy I have in my business. We usually operate at about 70-80% of capacity, and that means we have premium pricing. But because we have this Slack built into the operations, whenever there is emergency or urgent campaign, we are there for the client because we
exactly.
can do that. So yeah, I can relate to that.
But that's good. And part of and like that's a perfect example. So let's use that, right?
Mm-hmm.
We talked of the B2B elements of value, and one of them was responsiveness, right? And that's part of these. So you've realized that this is one of your strategic advantages. I'm going to be very responsive to my clients. To make that happen, you're incurring a cost. There's a lot of planning and cost here because that 78%, that means you're working at 3/4 capacity almost. You could be making 33% more of what you're doing right now. So if you're bringing in $100, you could be bringing 133 approximately. You're sacrificing that money so that you can have premium pricing and so that you can sort of do every other thing you're mentioning. So what I'm saying is there's a lot of forethought here. There's a lot of planning here and how you're going to be responsive, right? Like who's going to sort of like, let's say the website craft or something and someone needs to assess something or there's an emergency. How you respond to an emergency, I'm pretty sure you have a template or something for it. Like you don't just wing it. You sort of know if there's an emergency of this, these are like the things I look at. If there's sort of like a time crunch and I have a meeting with another client, we'll move things around this way. Like you've been here before where you know how you're going to shift, move everything around, investigate, tackle, and solve so that your client is up and running again or whatever the emergency is.
No, absolutely. The business is essentially a collection of processes. That's where the value is.
100%. Like having clear operating procedures is super important and like documenting them is even more important because it facilitates onboarding. But in any case, whatever happens, so long as you're able to be clear on like why we're putting the Slack in the system and what are the results. And sometimes the Slack is not just about being responsive. It's about giving people the space to grow. In other words, I could be having someone work at 75% capacity because the 25%, I need you to learn this. I want you to study this. I'm investing in you because I know, for instance, that I need you to sort of grow into this role. So again, you just have to be clear on what you're doing, why you're doing it, and why it makes sense.
Yeah, always start with the why, really. And
100%, 100%.
That will save you so much time and money. You mentioned a while ago, really like a proper while ago, actually, that something about recycling content and that you would turn things into a PDF, for example. Can we just stop for a minute to talk about when recycling makes sense and how much of it should be reposting the same thing? Because, for example, you said Twitter lives on this, a tweet lives only 6 hours. Or, for example, on LinkedIn, a post that's probably 1 month or older doesn't even come to the surface anymore. Should we just repost it as is because like only 10% of our audience saw it? So just if you could speak to that, it'd be great.
So 100%, like there's no problem with the reposting, right? Like that, like nobody, like it's never harmful unless you're spammy about it. That's a problem.
Yeah.
So there are 2 points here. A, can we repost? And B, how do we recycle content?
Yes.
And I want to answer both. So how do we should we repost content? The answer is yes. And the shorter the half-life, like the shorter something lives on a platform, the more you can repost it. Specifically, if it's like, don't repost content that never resonated. Like if I posted something and nobody reacted to it, then it doesn't make sense, right? But like if something I posted and everybody was super hyped up about it, post it again. Like there's nothing wrong with that, and a lot of top content creators do that. So all the more power to you. But obviously, like the one thing that I would say here, and this is like, is the shorter the lifespan of something, the more you can, like for instance on Twitter, since the lifespan is super short, you could post it a week and then the week after. But LinkedIn, it has a longer memory a bit. So like you might want to wait a couple of months before posting it. Like that's the one caveat that I put there. But other than that, it's all good. Flip side here is when it comes to recycling or repurposing content, you want to think of it in different ways. First of all, you want to think in terms of channel distribution. And then you want to think in terms of the content format. And I'll explain what I mean by those two. So from content channel, that means like if I have something that's working on Instagram, can I use it on TikTok? Can I repurpose it for LinkedIn or Twitter? It's the same piece of content. I'm just putting it on a different distribution channel. Specifically, if it's resonated on one channel, and maybe it might, maybe it might not. It might not be suitable for the channel, or it might not be suitable for the audience themselves, right? Like, for instance, you always find those cases. But then the other element is the format. So, for instance, I could take long form content such as a blog and cut a bit out of it to create a tweet. Or I could take several blog pieces and create an ebook. So you could either take something that's long and shortened or their way. Or you could have a blog piece and turn it into a podcast. So you have someone read it out and it becomes something people could listen to. And that's even more doable with AI these days. Or you could have someone write a summary of it, a script, shoot it on video. And that's another way of repurposing, where this is a piece of content that resonated a lot. Why not create a piece of like video or something that's audio visual about it, right? And the other way around. So, for instance, this podcast, you could literally have it sort of become an entire blog piece that people could read. You could have Twitter snippets that you could share on X. So there are so many ways to go about it, and at the end of the day, it always becomes a matter of at the end of the day, which platform makes the most sense for this type of content, all that. But it just boosts the return you get on every piece of content. So rather than the piece of content being a blog piece or something that you create once, it's something that you could keep on recycling and reusing and putting here and there, and it just becomes super valuable throughout.
Maybe a more challenging part to recycling content is deciding which piece of content to recycle, right? And you probably have to reach for some kind of engagement metrics to see what is worth your time to spend on. Because a while ago you said on LinkedIn, some things might not resonate very well, some will, and I can totally see that. I even raised the point that I don't know what I did right for the post that did well. So you could probably go back, pick on those, and then recycle them into different formats, different whatever sizes, or cut them up into pieces, like however you like it. So yeah, no, would you say that that's the best route to go for? Just to go for the most popular posts and then recycle them, or would you try to recycle something that's supposedly dead but might work elsewhere?
So I think there are a couple of things here. Like when you're creating content, like for me, when I'm writing content, there are usually like one of three cases, right? Like either I know this is a piece that I don't think is going to do well, but like we're creating it because we want, let's say, let's say, for instance, we're writing an ebook at some point, but we're writing it in chapters. So this piece is a chapter that we needed for the entire thing to be complete. And we're publishing it as a blog initially before putting it in an ebook. But I don't really have a lot of faith in it, right? So it doesn't do well. I'm not going to post it. I'm not going to care about it. But the two pieces that matter, the two types of content that matter, are the pieces that do better than you expect or do good in general, and the pieces that you knew should do good and they didn't do well.
Oh yeah,
right. So
there's more of those.
Post both of those and see what happens. Right. Like if you get if a piece did well and then it does well again, the likelihood that it got lucky the first time and then the second time is minimal. It's slower. And the piece that you really believed in and you sent out twice, if it didn't resonate with anybody, then most likely people weren't interested in it. Just because, and this is one of the hardest things when you're creating content, you have to sort of really internalize. Just because something is interesting to you does not mean it's going to be interesting to everybody else. And a lot of people were like, not gonna, and I do this all the time. Like, all the times I'll feel like this is such an interesting piece of nugget. And then it's like, it resonates with nobody. I'm like, all right, cool. So, hey, I found this interesting. And that's the thing. You build a sense, obviously, but still, you're always learning. And the other thing that I'll say is, you always want to minimize the costs and boost the return when you can. So the easiest thing is to take a format and maintain it. So taking video and keeping it in video is easier than taking video and turning it into a blog, because that would require a lot of editing, a lot of formatting, a lot of everything else. But and it's always easier to take something long and turn it to short than to take something short and then expand it into something long. So that's another thing. And obviously planning matters. Again, like this goes back to the content calendar. Like if I know that we're creating a series of things based on, like for instance, let's say we're creating lower funnel content based on a lot of FAQs we've gotten. So we've gotten a lot of people asking us these lists of questions. We're going to put them all in really one big book, but we're going to address each one comprehensively first. So we're going to create a series of blog posts that we're going to put out. And then once we've put them all out, we're going to collect them together in an ebook and distribute them to people. Anytime someone asks us one of these questions, we send them the entire ebook. For instance, that's one strategy you could have, right? So there's a lot of planning there, 100%, and you get that stuff out. But I feel that the repurposing here and having that ebook and everything else, because you saw it coming ahead, it's easier. But the other way around is, if I don't know the topics we're going to be discussing, it becomes much harder to put them all or coalesce them all into a single book, because the book will feel very disjointed. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. It does. Yeah. I see.
I don't know if I'm saying this wrong.
No. That makes sense. So we like, I understand that content is really multi-layered. There's so many like, it's not something that you worry about later. Like, you have business strategy, there's marketing strategy, and content is a huge part of it. I mean, at the end of the day, content is what everything that you put out, what gets seen, what gets watched, to listen to, etc. So there's so many things going into it, and then when you add on top of it like things like user experience and how you distribute that on the website or elsewhere, it becomes mind-boggling how it all needs to work together seamlessly. But I can't shake the feeling that website is like in the epicenter of it all. It's like it sort of stitches those pieces together. Is that how we should think about websites? And how does a good website support content strategy, in your opinion?
So I'll say this much. Should the website be at the epicenter? Yes and no. I want to explain that. Okay?
Yeah,
so
sure.
Sorry. That sounds a bit opaque.
No, that's okay.
No, I'm thinking about it.
Mhm.
The way I think about it, it all depends on the strategy, right? Like, a lot of companies will make the website at the epicenter. And the reason this matters is because the website is the one thing that you really control the best. In other words, when you're on LinkedIn, when you're on social media, you don't really control those platforms. LinkedIn could get up tomorrow and shut down your website, your LinkedIn channel, everything else. But the other thing you control aside your website are your email lists, right? So for instance, a lot of businesses, and specifically we're talking about smaller businesses, let's say for instance freelance and everything else, their main sort of like advantage is like they put out newsletters, and their newsletters are really high quality and everything else. So I think it all boils down to the business strategy. Is the website a channel of acquisition? Is the website something that makes sense to invest in? Because it's a huge investment.
Oh, it is.
For some companies, 1,000% it should be the epicenter. For some companies, or some businesses, not necessarily. But what I will say is, you want to divorce content from the website. The website can be an excellent repository for your content. But even if the business is offline, it could use content in a lot of ways. And that's happened a lot of times with brochures, with companies having pamphlets. Like, they did content, but content became way more at the forefront in the digital age, 100%. But there was some element of content marketing, but it's nowhere near what we have today. So websites for a lot of businesses, like digitally focused businesses, make sense. And you and I work in the tech space, so 100% most of our customers work there. And how can a website help with your content strategy? Well, first of all, for instance, if you're creating for instance, there are different ways, but the most common way to build a content strategy, specifically if you're not the Forbes or the company with a really high domain authority, what will end up happening is you'll probably go for something like a topic cluster strategy or a pillar strategy. It's like something along those lines, to be able to stand out and to be able to attract traffic to your websites. And a lot of those topic clusters or pillars will be defined by your website structure, or like the architecture of your website, because a lot of the service pages and the landing pages become the lower funnel pillars that you're trying to drive traffic to, and you're building a lot of SEO efforts around that. So I'll say this much. Websites are excellent repositories. You control them 100%. That is perfect. But just be clear on what you want your website to function, and be clear on how it fits within your overall strategy. And that will make the entire content strategy much easier. If your website is all over the place, designed by commission, content becomes too separated and it just becomes a headache.
I can. I've actually used the topic cluster strategy myself. We've built the whole sort of group of posts, blog posts, and webinars, etc., around web design workshops. And people would start searching for web design workshops, how else to approach web design other than what's known out there traditionally. And just to give you an example, for example, we talked about navigation. So there's a content about how does good navigation look like, but also there's content about drop downs, about site structure, overall site structure, what should be the first item in the navigation, how about call to actions. And so we build the whole holistic picture of a navigation, so that whenever someone lands in one of those pieces, they won't leave, because every single question, every single answer is on our website already. And that also helps Google with understanding what's our strength and how to position us, because people find this content more relevant. So
Love it.
yeah.
Beautiful, beautiful work, man. And that is the point, right? Like, but a lot of that is not just beautiful stuff. This is stuff like that I would argue works in tandem with your website, because you're clear on what you want your website to stand for and everything else. But I would go a step further and say, if you were at, let's say, a trade show or something, having that content accessible and being able to show it, whether on your website or through anything else, is super important, as a PDF or whatever you may have. So at the end of the day, is the website important as a repository, as a library, for all that purpose, for something that continues along your market strategy? 100%. But content isn't just about that. It's about the brand. It's about sort of converting customers. Like, for instance, one way some companies use content is during the sales process, not the marketing process. Like the lower funnel, in the sense of, when a customer asks a question, in the email, they'll send them a link to the piece. Like, for instance, one of the books that I like is, I think Mark Sheridan, I don't remember his name. It's called They Ask You Answer. It's a very simple book. It talks about everything. And the author talks about his journey with content marketing. He worked at, and I think he worked at a pool company, a company that installed a type of pools. And what he would do is, he would have people read an entire ebook. He'd send them through email before every call. And the people who read the ebook through its entirety, A, their conversion rate was highest, but B, they had little to no time to ask, so their conversion time was minimized, because they knew exactly what to expect, how things looked, and they had their most pressing questions answered. So, I mean, you could distribute content through email, you could distribute content through a lot of other platforms. So thinking that without a website, you can't have content is not how you want to approach it. But thinking of website and content working in tandem is super important. And thinking of website being the home base for your content makes sense.
Yeah. So it seems like educating customer and eliminating those silly questions up front before sales calls just increases the lead to sale, decreases the lead to sale time, increases the quality of that lead, and makes the sales process just, you get to cut to the chase almost.
100%.
Yeah.
1,000%. And it's not just that. They trust you more, right? Because like I'll put it for you simply this way. Like, I was just reading a couple of articles, and usually, like, when I read, I like to read from different publications, different companies that publish this, publish content about this. When you read content from, say, let's say a piece that feels this content is well thought out, this content goes in depth, and this content is unique, or it's not something like, this is the one that's this article stood out compared to the other 7 or 8 I looked at. Automatically, I want to learn more about that company, right? Because, like, is this just an exceptional article, or is all their content like this? So you build trust in the brand, you build trust in a lot of elements. So it's not just education cutting the chase, it's that sense of, it becomes the first step for people to learn about what your brand values are, what your brand will be like. And again, like, almost 70% of, like, the entire research is done before someone interacts with you. So right now, unless you're doing really direct sales and you're like knocking on doors or sending cold emails, you want people to be excited to sort of hop on a call with you. And one of the ways is content.
You've got a very important job, you know. It stretches from the very beginning to the very end of the funnel across the board. And it's just mind-boggling how much you have to think about, really. Website. So we focus only on website, and obviously website, as you said, it is just one channel of acquisition, but the overarching theme is content. And you are there. You exist in that wider spectrum.
I promise you, like, so this is how I think. I think every part is important. Like I think the website specifically, because if you build a strategy around, like you could have an entire strategy and none of it involves content, but then you're investing
Mhm.
a lot in networking, a lot in everything else because you're selling to people who understand this, or you're selling to. In other words, you see that.
Yeah.
Everybody's gonna have their own strategy. I'm just saying, content can really help your strategy if that's what you're basing it on. Website is super important because there are entire businesses where their entire strategy, like for instance, Casper, their entire business model, they used to sell like sort of mattresses and everything else. Their entire business was direct to customer because mattresses in the States are usually sold sort of like mattress stores and everything else. And once you remove that component, they were able to sort of beat the competition through, superior logistics or whatever. Dell, when they started, they had a direct to consumer business model. So at the end of the day, whether it's website, whether it's content, all these things are just tools. What
Yeah.
really matters is your business strategy. How are you going to create differentiation? How are you going to build a sustainable business advantage that is a sort of moat that nobody's able to trespass? Once you have that, you figure out what are the best tools to help you sort of create those and reinforce them or not. But it starts with the business strategy. That's where it all matters.
We are singing praises about content all the time here. Is there anything that content can't do for us? For example, some kind of quick wins are not possible. Maybe it's a long-term game rather than short game.
Oh, 100%. Everything you're saying is true. So first of all, content will never convert someone who doesn't like it's like think of content like a salesperson, right?
Mm-hmm.
Salespeople at the end of the day, they're never going to convert someone who doesn't want to buy, someone who isn't interested. It's not going to work that. It's just something that helps you scale faster. It's something that helps you reach a much wider audience at a fraction of the cost. But it still takes time. And then the distribution of the content, the visibility, the awareness, all that takes element. Again, like if nobody knows about your company, you're still starting out, then all the content in the world is not going to get you on the map. It's going to take a lot of time.
Yeah.
So is there such a thing as limitations to content? Let me rephrase your question. Are there times when it makes sense that you shouldn't invest in content? I'd say you would reduce your element, like your investment content, if, for instance, you're operating in a limited market where the number of potential customers isn't that large. So, for instance, if I'm a supermarket here in Cairo, then investing in content doesn't make sense because there aren't a lot of people who are going to be buying from me aside from those living in my neighborhood. Like the example that I used earlier about like a tech company in New York, unless they're like a chain or a franchise, investing in a Twitter channel would be a lot of effort trying to reach a global audience. They could use Twitter ads 100%.
Yeah.
But trying to build an organic following, of course, there are other ways. Like, for instance, some people use Twitter as a customer service channel. Although I love it.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm talking about the natural funnel of not maintaining or retaining your customers, but like actually acquiring them and going global. And even worse is SEO, because SEO is a really long-term play. Other times is, for instance, if it's a product that people are very indifferent about, low involvement, and it's something that people like. It's a modified rebuy, like everybody knows. For instance, if you're selling big pens, right? Like Bic isn't gonna be investing in content. Everybody knows who Bic. Everybody knows who Oreo is. Everybody sort of either buys Oreo or Twinkies or Ho-Hos, but like they're not gonna really need content to explain what that is. So FMCG in general isn't a big user of content. Fashion uses content, but not necessarily education. It uses more sort of for illustrative purposes, everything else. Imagery and photo shoots are all that. They're a type of content. They're just not educational. So even the purpose here changes. So the bottom line is this. You always need to communicate with your customer. And content is just a type of communication. Like content is basically what you're going to be communicating. It's like the gist of the message. At least I think of it in that way, which is more abstracted. But like people segment the communication, obviously. But what I'll say is this. what type of communication you should be having with your customer differs based on a lot of things we've discussed today, right? Like the niche you're in, the type of things you sell, your strategy, the way you're differentiating yourself. These are all things. And once you've decided what kind of communication makes sense and how you're going to deliver that communication, that in of itself is its own story. But you will always need to communicate. It's just a matter of how.
The way I like to approach this is what Ogilvy said. Every time you write an ad or a piece of content, whatever, imagine you are talking to a person in real life, one-to-one. Is that how would you talk? Is that what you would say? And this is something he would really emphasize on to really drive the point about sounding just natural, concise, well spoken, and to the point. And that's where the whole concept of removing adjectives come from, and just unnecessary words, and yeah, that's the whole game that he had. But basically, the thing of imagining person in front of you and talking to them is very powerful to me.
I love that, and I think it's so true because, like, and it's even true so online, right? Because a lot of things you also see online is that a lot of people want to write like really sort of like formal writing. But that's the thing. Digital writing is way more informal. Like the way we talk online, like of course it differs by platform, and that's another thing, right? Like LinkedIn and Twitter, the way you write and create content for them, you want to be approaching a different mentality, one more informal than the other, one more conversational than the other. But that being said, digital online, like even blogs need to have that informality. Like you can say you, and that's fine. That's one thing. But the other thing that I also agree with is like even not just the way you talk, but the structure of your content. Like for instance, when you're on a sales call, like for instance, one of the frameworks I like when it comes to sales is spin selling, right? Spin selling stands for situation, problem, implication, need, payoff. It's a framework basically. And the thing is, when you look at the framework and you contrast it to other copywriting frameworks, such as for instance, PASS, problem, agitate, solution, you find that those two frameworks are really similar. Like they're almost one for one going together. It's just that one is done on a landing page and one is done by a salesperson in a call. But you still need to communicate with the person. And usually the message is similar on some level. There's some parallels in there. But yeah, I agree entirely. You want to write as if you're talking to someone. Love it.
So before I wrap this up, I'm aware of the time we're here. Do you? So okay, I've heard about this notion of dumbing down the content, and what it essentially means to write in a way that doesn't sound too smart, so you don't come across as too smart to the audience, even though you know a lot. You know, the curse of knowledge, all of that. Do you believe in such a thing? Do you believe that dumbed down content is better than one that goes deep into the concept on social media or blog posts, whatever? Or is there a place for both?
Ooh, okay. So those are like 2-3 different questions. I want to separate them together, right?
Yeah, go
so
ahead.
First of all, how do I feel about dumbed down content? And I'll talk about a second. Should I post that on social media, which is the second thing? And the third point is like, how do brands approach this in general? So how do I feel? I feel that dumbed down content is entirely fine. I love it. I'm all for it. But dumbed down content isn't oversimplified content. I want to explain what I mean by that. I could talk about something completely technical, but I'm not using the lingo of the space. I'm just simplifying it. It's like I'd explain it. It's like if like I'm a very curious person, right? If I'm sitting with, let's say, an engineer who works in a car engineer, car mechanic, like someone who sort of like designs cars, I'll ask him about things and I'll really dive deep in with him, and I like want to understand, you know, the particulars of the engine and everything else. And he could explain it to me, but he doesn't have to use the same terminology he'd use with another mechanical engineer, right? And that is a difference between talking in a way that is easy for everybody to understand. And this is the thing you see, like for instance, if you read academic papers, right? It's very easy to see how academic papers use language that's too complicated and that tries to sort of it tries to be too unique, or like hey, this, it's like you don't have to be highbrow. Like talk about like the stuff you're talking about is interesting. Just use normal language. Like for instance, you don't have to talk about it in super like there's even like that term, like this is academic language. It's like you don't have to have that. But like think of it this way. Imagine an academic paper that's super interesting, but that's still written in a way that your younger cousin could understand, right?
Mm-hmm.
That is the kind of content I love. It's content that's very interesting. The material is gripping. Maybe not everybody understands why this is a question, or maybe like like some content, unfortunately, you would struggle to talk about it without getting into the technicalities. But I'd say for like 95% of the stuff online, you could easily simplify, not dumb it down, but simplify it without losing the nuance or the intrigue there. And that's what
Yeah,
I like.
I think analogies play an important part here.
Oh,
I,
100%.
I often create analogies when I write on LinkedIn in regards to real life and simple things. For example, when I say about cohesive user experience versus coherent user experience, that would probably fly over most people's heads. Like, what the hell? They kind of know what user experience is, but that probably don't really. But when you say it in a way that is very approachable to the even 13-year-old person, everybody will get it, and everybody will relate, and they even might engage in comments with you, right? So it's very important that the choice of words, the level of language that you use. And yes, we all know you want to sound smart, and you are smart. No one's taking that away from you. But I think the art of communicating difficult concepts in a simple way is also an art of itself. And that, in fact, in my opinion, indicates how smart you are.
Oh,
If
100%.
yeah,
I was just going to say that. I agree. I think true intelligence is taking something that's seemingly complicated and explaining it in such a simple way that
yeah,
it just makes sense. So I completely agree with that. I think that's 100% on point. I do want to answer two more questions because you made the 2 points. Should you be posting in depth on social media? So I'll answer that quickly.
okay,
And
okay,
okay, so that point, because that is an interesting point, you have to understand that each social media is treated differently. In other words, people on TikTok have different behaviors than people on Twitter, than people on YouTube. People on YouTube are searching for information, so you can really go in depth there.
mm-hmm.
People on Twitter, they're browsing and they're just looking at their feed, and they're not going to consume a lot of information. They might give you 2 or 4 minutes, but they're not going to give you half an hour of their time. So the point is, going in depth on different platforms doesn't make sense because you need to cater or tailor your content for the platform. And again, maintaining that sense of like simplifying and maybe dumbing down, but not losing the nuance. You maintain it, but you realize you just have to tailor the content to the platform.
Mm-hmm.
And how brands approach it, I think brands try to sometimes overcomplicate it a bit, but I feel that in 95% case, it's not needed. But again, there might be some strategies where someone makes an argument, you entertain it, and maybe there might be some merit there. But for the most part, I feel that 95% case things can be simple and still be very interesting and intriguing.
Yeah. So just communicate it in a simple way, but not too simple. I think Einstein said it,
Yep.
and that's there is a fine line in that as well. But usually we use the Flash ease reading score to double check if we're on the
100%.
track. Yeah. Um,
Love it. Yeah, completely agree.
You mentioned a few books during the call today. So, as the final question to you, could you recommend to us a few books that you would tell us to go ahead and read right now about the content?
So, all right, I'll tell you, like, so I'm a big believer that you need to start with strategy first. So, I'll recommend
Mm-hmm.
Jobs to Be Done. Start there. Read Competing Against Luck by Clayton Christensen and Jobs to Be Done by Tony Ulwick. Also, read Playing to Win by A.G. Lafley. And this is a complete strategy book. It's a beautiful book. I love it. And read Thinking in Bets by Annie Duke. That was the one we talked about sort of decision making and uncertainty, right? So those are, your basic strategy. Content marketing. There is they ask you answer. That's a good one. HubSpot also has a nice certificate for content marketing that I think is nice. Like if you're beginning and you've like never done content marketing before, start there. It will give you a good primer, a good idea on like what cluster strategy is, keyword strategy, all that. If you want to go higher, like other people offer courses, but like for instance, some of the books that I like is Epic Content Marketing. There are a lot of like other smaller books. Like let me take a look here.
You mentioned Steven Pinker's Sense of Style, where that
That's
falls.
no, but this is writing. Like so we'll talk about writing in a second, but these are like this
Okay.
is content marketing simply. So Like, for instance, if you want marketing strategy, it depends on where you are in the spectrum, right? Like, for instance, the simplest content marketing strategy book that I'd recommend is by Alex Hormozy. You have $100 million offers and $100 million leads. This is more about conversion. So those are interesting. There's also sort of traction. This is good. I'm just looking through the list. 22 Laws of Branding. Epic Content Marketing by Joe Paluzzi. That's a nice one. Oh, you have Content is Cash. I like this one, but this is more about repurposing. Like, this is one of the first books that I read. It's super old, but at least old by the internet standards. But the way it helps you think about distribution and repurposing is really good. And this is all content marketing. Like, we're not talking about cold emailing or anything else right now.
Yeah.
Regarding sense of style, that one actually is more about writing. So for me, what I'd recommend when it comes to writing is this. You want to start off with the basics, right? Talk about the elements of style by William Strunk and E.B. White. That one is the basic. Then read Sense of Style, Steven Pinker. You could also read Letting Go of the Words by Janice Reddish. This is a must read for anybody. So Letting Go of the
I like
Words.
the sound of it.
Really.
Really.
So Letting Go of the Words is basically about sort of not about writing per se, but about how to write for the internet. So how to format, how people consume content, right? Like, she shows you sort of different examples of content that's well structured and well formatted versus content that's too exhausting or content that's overwhelming. So I think that Letting Go of the Words, if you're gonna write for like the internet, it's definitely a must read that you have to have on your list. Yeah. On Writing Well, it's another good book. Yeah. I think
that's already probably 1 year of reading, at least for me. I don't.
No, I think for me, some of these books were really helpful, and I think I won't say they changed, but like they really opened my eyes. Like, oh, I never considered that before. So
these books are the best, honestly. Yeah, I love finding books like this, and thank you so much for recommending them to us. I'll definitely look into them. I'll make sure there are links in the description. So don't worry if you didn't catch that. Before we go, where people can find you, because I bet there are plenty of follow-up questions, and even from me, just overall, where they can find you, and how to get in touch with you in the best way.
I think best way is LinkedIn. Like, I'm in a space right now. I'm trying to build a company in New York. Things are going well, so probably build a website where obviously like a lot of sort of the conversation we've had right now. But no, like currently my main concern more is like all of my mutual levels. So LinkedIn is best. It's Ibrahim Zaghw, Zaghw. And yeah, I'm always happy to answer any questions, content or otherwise.
Awesome. No, thank you so much.
No, thank you
also link to your profile. This was
awesome.
That was so good. I can't even believe this was 2 hours already, but no, really so good. Thank you. And I wish we can talk again at some point in the future.
I'm excited for that. Definitely looking forward to it.
Thank you. All right. Thanks so much.
Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to my conversation with Ibrahim. To support this podcast, please leave a follow or share it with a friend. I hope to see you next time.